Next time, Roger and Sarah travel to Montana and Glacier National Park, spending the afternoon at the Many Glacier Hotel. Roger will be working on a large studio painting with details of the mountains and lake.
For many years, we've wanted to visit Glacier National Park, and after driving 2,716 miles, we arrived. We couldn't wait to get out and stretch our legs and feel the fresh mountain air. The scenery exceeded our expectations. We loved the jagged look of the glacier-etched mountains and the gouged-out valleys, some filled with crystal-clear glacier water, producing a dazzling lake. We spent our first day in the Many Glacier Valley on the northeast side of the park and looked around the Many Glacier Hotel. Later, we walked along the Swift Current Nature Trail, where Roger found the scene he would use for a large canvas painting back in the studio.
Glacier National Park is a fabulous place to visit. When we were there, I did a number of plein air paintings, and I'll show you some of them now. Now, these paintings were all done on a gessoed masonite board, and I like to work on the boards like this because they don't take up much space while we're traveling. And of course, by using acrylics, they dry fast, and within an hour or so I can even spray some acrylic varnish over these to protect them while we're traveling. And I love to paint outside because I can see so much more color than I can in any photograph that I take. So there's a nice learning experience by being outside. So that's a few of the paintings that I did while in the Glacier National Park. Now, obviously, I can't do a painting like this in a half hour, but I'm going to try and go through the main steps of this painting and bring it to a completion. Now, one tip I have while I'm painting larger paintings, especially in the studio here, there are a number of great publications out there, magazines that feature artists, Plein Air Painting magazines, Southwestern art magazines, and so on. Now, whenever I have one of those magazines, I go through it and I clip out paintings that especially speak to me, and I put them in a folder like this. And so then when I have a painting like this, for instance, I might want to change the sky on this. I can look through a book such as this, and I can get some really nice inspiration from some other artists. Doesn't mean that I'm copying these other artists, but I'm just looking at their work, seeing how they approach different ways to handle different subjects, and maybe I can glean some information and that can help me along. So on this particular day we were at the park, this was a totally blue sky, and I wanted to put some other clouds in there. So I found some art here from some other artists, and I'll just look over at that occasionally, and that might help me along to create my own painting. And today I'm using oil paints on linen canvas, and I covered this yesterday with some acrylics. Just put a wash of some blues up here and some burnt umber and burnt sienna colors down here, just to get rid of that white background that sometimes annoys me when I'm painting. It's just easier for me to work over an area that has something on it other than just stark white. Now I have my reference photo right over here to my right on my laptop monitor, so it's easy to see. And I think I'll start with the sky today. And I have these oil paints. Now I drew this out in pencil fairly accurately, and after I put the acrylics over that, I put the acrylics over this quite thin so I can still see my pencil lines through here. I don't want to establish too much of a pattern here yet in the sky because there's so much going on down here. I don't want my sky to fight with all the interest going on down here. The sky is kind of secondary to what the really center of interest is, but I do want something in the sky because this is a large area, so I just don't want a plain blue sky. I'm going to leave the clouds the way they are for now. I'm not going to try and put in any more detail than what I have here. Just lay them in, because the most important thing to do a big painting like this is to do the large, big shapes, because if all these big shapes and big areas are placed in first, then all the details will fall in place. It's easy to get caught up in too many details too soon. Now I'm picking up some of my ultramarine blue, some yellow ochre here, and I'm going to start with this large mountain right back in here. Now all these colors are going to change as I go along because everything, the way I paint everything as I go along, needs to be adjusted. I can't really tell if this is the right color or not until I get some other colors on here, because this is always a matter of comparison of one color to the next. One color may look good just by itself, but when another color is placed next to it, it may not look right. So I adjust all the time as I go. Another thing I have to keep telling myself is to use enough paint on this so it looks like a painting. I don't want this to look like a watercolor. So I have to use enough paint on here to keep these brush strokes looking full. If these oil paints just get too thin, especially on canvas, the painting will look very weak. So I need to get some thick, rich strokes on here as I go. I keep referencing my photograph. I think I'll just move across the board here now and put in some of these distant mountains. Of course, they're going to be much lighter because they're in the distance. Taking some white and some phthalo blue. I think that'll be a good color for these distant mountains. Now, areas that don't catch as much light, in other words, dark areas, they can be applied with a thinner coat of paint. But any areas that have a lot of sunlight on them, the actual paint needs to be thicker. It just is much more pleasing in a painting to see it done that way. And then this mountain over here to the far left is somewhat closer to us, so that will be darker. So I'll take my ultramarine blue, maybe a touch of burnt umber. Now these glaciers are really disappearing up there. We saw photographs of this same scene here back in the 1940s and the 50s, and then present day, and these glaciers back here where the snow is and all just keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. We use this same blue over here, and we'll put in this one distant mountain to our far right. I may put in a little accent here or there, maybe a highlight where some snow is or something, but I want to keep these simple because there's a lot of texture down here that needs to be dealt with. Now as we get closer to the foreground, we'll start to see some of the trees down here. So I'll get some of my chromium oxide green, but I'm going to keep it quite light as there's still a lot of atmosphere between me and this mountain here. Maybe a touch of yellow. There's quite a bit of sunlight coming across there. And this slopes right down in there. I need to be pretty accurate with the shapes and the patterns in these mountains because this is such a recognizable place. I'm not trying to make an historic painting here or anything like that, but this is a particular location, so I want to keep these shapes as accurate as I can and still use some artistic license whenever I need to. I'm going to pick up chromium oxide green and burnt sienna, maybe a touch of blue, and we have a very dark area of mountains right over in this area here. I'm just going to pick up other colors as I go. Here's some sap green. Now we'll start seeing the contrast between these distant mountains and things in the foreground. I'm going to put a touch of white in here because these trees in this area here are still in the distance somewhat, so I don't want these quite as dark as anything that's going to go right here in the foreground. I'm not trying to paint individual trees here at all. I'm trying to paint large shapes. So these large clusters of trees. I'm thinking about shapes. I'm not thinking about trees. Eventually it'll get down to where I have to think about maybe individual trees, but right now it's the large patterns that I'm looking for. Right in here we have a waterfall, which is going to be a beautiful, I think, kind of a center of interest. So I want to work carefully around here. And one way to bring attention to an area is by increasing the contrast between the areas. So if I have some dark trees back here and I have a very light patch of water, you know, a warm white waterfall, it's going to really bring the eye here because of the contrast between the dark trees and the light water. So we'll get into that later, but I'm keeping that in mind as I put in these bigger areas of color. So I've got my dark trees in here, and now I'm going to layer a few of the lighter trees over that. And I'm going to use some red in my green. If you ever have trouble with your greens, try putting a little red in them and see what happens, because greens are hard to work with, and often by putting in a red color, it will change your green to maybe just what you need. So you see I'm taking these lighter colors and I'm putting them around my darks now. Now this will probably be an important area of the painting. That's where this waterfall is, and there's a beautiful cliff area here. So I'm going to just take a brush and, by looking at my reference photograph, add some of these features here. It will give me a better roadmap as to where to put some of these areas of these rocks. Just using my brush to draw these. And then there's a nice S-curve in this painting too. It's a little path that comes around here and down. So that will enter into this composition too. It's a little bit subtle, but it's a nice little S-curve. S-curves are good in paintings because they lead the viewer's eye back and give it some distance and some depth. Well, now I'm going to concentrate on this area right down here where these cliffs are, and there's a stream running underneath here. Can't see the stream very much, just a little bit up here where the waterfall is. This is very dark down in this area. So I'll take some burnt umber and ultramarine blue. That'll give me a nice dark gray color. And we'll start by putting in some of just these very dark areas here. It's also a warm area because there's a lot of reflected light coming up into here. So I'm going to add some burnt sienna to the mix. Not paying any attention to much detail at this point, just trying to get the large areas in, and that's a goal of this whole procedure at this point, is to get the canvas covered and get the large areas in place. Okay, now I'm picking up some red and yellow and making an orange color. It's very warm right in here. I may have to cut this down with some blue. I think it may be a bit too warm, but I do like all the color in this foreground and all these rocks. I'm putting in more color than I actually see in my photograph, because the photograph tends to equalize everything and wash out the light areas and make dark areas even darker. So I'm just playing with the color here to try and make it more of what I remember. I have this beautiful path right here, and I'll use a lot of paint putting this path in because it's light, and I want the texture to show up in these light areas, because these textures will help describe the actual texture on the ground there, these pebbles and rocks and so on. Just this rough brushstroke texture will help create that look. There's a number of small rocks and boulders right down here at the bottom of this river. So with some smaller strokes, I'm going to just indicate a few of those. Get some cool color in there too. Have some rocks that are catching some light right up in here. I think this may be the toughest part of the painting because this will really be a focus area here, so it needs to be done very carefully. I'm not going to hurry through this area. Some of these other areas I can go over pretty fast, but this area here I really have to take my time and think about it. With white, a touch of yellow ochre, I'm going to put in this waterfall right here. And again, an area that has a lot of light on it should be applied with thick paint. And even though I can't see the water down here in the photograph, I know it's down there, so I'm going to place an indication that the water goes right through here. Now my palette needs to be cleaned off here. It's getting a little bit too much paint on here. So I take a palette knife, I scrape this off, and the nice thing about this, I've got some paint here. I can put it in another area of my board, mix it around, and I'll get a nice color there that may really come in handy a little bit later on for some of these trees and things, because it's a combination of everything I've used. So that's a nice little pile of paint there that I can use again and again during the painting, and now I have a clean surface once more to paint on. Well, I've almost accomplished my goal of getting the canvas entirely covered, except for this area here. Now in my photograph, there is very little information in the photograph itself, so I'm going to have to make that up as I go to some degree. I don't want there to be lots and lots of detail in these rocks down here, even though they are in the foreground, because this is a portion of the painting that doesn't require the artist to look at very much. It's sort of superfluous to the whole idea of the painting. So I'm not going to put in very much detail here on these rocks, but I certainly do have to indicate them. I'll take some of my dark colors, ultramarine blue and some burnt sienna, just a little bit of everything here. Make a very dark color. And now I'll try and define a few of these rocks. Some of these rocks have some hard shadows underneath them. Okay, so now I have my middle tone values here. I've got some darks. Well, this is the fun part of the painting now. Now that everything is covered, now I can go back and start refining certain areas. Now when I painted this mountain, this blue color, it looked right at the time, but now that I have all these other colors on here, this blue just seems too intense. And that's why I don't like to work on the details too soon, because these things have to change as it goes along. But now I'm going to start to refine each area as I go, and I'm going to start up here with the mountain. And I can put in some of these ridges and areas where the light is hitting it, and just start refining this area. Now this paint is very wet, and it might, if it's too wet, I may have to just stop and wait for a day or two for it to dry if this paint is too thick on here, or I can just use really heavy paint to put over it. I can see that this grass here is too light, and I need to work on the highlights on this side of the mountain with some warm colors. Right in here we've got some sunlight hitting this area. And again, I'll use thick paint in areas that are being hit by sunlight. It's a beautiful lake right back here, and people were canoeing on it, kayaking. In fact, just for fun, let's take some white and this warm color, some yellow. Here's where this lake is, right back here. And that's a beautiful focal point. I'll mix some dark green here and start to define the edges of all these trees in this area. So far what I've done was blocked in the areas with the big shapes, and now it's time to define these areas within the large shapes. And there are a lot of trees in here, and some of them are going to overlap, so I need some different colors and variations of green so any overlapping trees will show up. I'm just using a light touch with my brush, and these pine trees are quite easy to create. And as you can see, I've layered these trees now with some dark areas, some warm colors, some light areas, so to make a variation amongst all these trees. Now I'm careful to keep the big shapes intact, but within these large shapes, I'll put all these variations here of these different colors and patterns of these trees. I'm taking some white and I'm scumbling some white right down here at the bottom of these falls just to make it look like a little bit of mist rising up. This is a very nice area right down here where the waterfall is. So to bring attention here, I've made this very dark and very light, and that contrast will help to bring the eye into that area. This area of cliffs is another important area, so now I'm putting in some subtle changes to define these areas of rocks. Some of these colors are very warm, some of them are cool down here. With this paint that I scraped off my palette earlier, I'm going to use some of that color, go up here, and I'm going to lay in a few trunks of these trees. I don't want these trunks to go all the way down. I don't want them to look like a dead tree, but you'll see a trunk here and there, it'll appear, then it'll disappear again. Well, when I first put this blue on the canvas, it looked like it was just about the right color, and I liked it. But now that everything is covered and I have all these other colors on there, this just appears too blue. I just don't like the looks of it. So on my palette, I'm once again using this color that I scraped off from all this area onto here. It's the combination of all the colors I've used, and it just seems like the perfect color, maybe with a touch of white, to add to this blue, to just cut down the intensity of that blue and make this color look a little more appropriate to the subject. I'm also picking up my palette knife. I'm going to use that for some of these areas down here where there may be some branches leading off of these rocks. Right in here, I'm going to take some more titanium white and just add a touch more of this mist. Down here with these bushes, I'm just adding a few more details to define it. I felt that these rocks here over on the right were just too bulky, so I made them smaller and pushed them back so they just didn't pop out quite so much. With these mountains back here, I'm adding a few more details right in here where there's some snow and glaciers, and I'm also adding a touch of greens here and there just to pull this all together. I'm adding a few more details right back here to these mountains, and then over here on this mountain I'm adjusting some of the colors slightly. That's all the time I have on this, but if you ever get a chance to visit the Glacier National Park, be sure and do so. It's a wonderful place with great subjects to paint.
When visiting Waterton Glacier National Park, there are a number of different lodges and hotels to stay in on the Canadian side as well as the American side. The handsome lobby areas are rustic and comfortable, welcoming visitors from all over the world. It was fun to sit and observe for a while. We heard many different languages being spoken and felt the shared excitement of seeing the park for the first time. We also felt a bit lightheaded, probably because we live on an island at 10 feet above sea level, and now we're at an elevation of 4,484 feet. Later, we felt hungry and ate at one of the restaurants with a lake view. We've found food usually helps us with any travel adjustments. There are lots of ways to see the park, and if you want to take a ride in a convertible, try a red bus tour. These great-looking old coaches were produced in the 1930s by the White Motor Company in Cleveland, Ohio, specifically for the national parks to show tourists the sights. Now, Glacier is the only park left that still uses them. The bus drivers are called jammers, referring to the sound of the gears of the past that could be heard grinding and jamming. Or you can take the park's free seasonal shuttle and see the incredible views right from your window seat as you cross the 55 miles to the other side of the park on the famous Going to the Sun Road. It has lots of curves and narrow passages, So we were only too happy to let someone else drive so we could relax and be passengers for a change and not miss a second looking out at the majestic mountains, counting glaciers, and watching the clouds change and low fog roll by. Logan Pass Visitor Center is at the halfway point, so we got off the shuttle to explore and found out that Logan Pass rises to 6,646 feet and is situated on the Continental Divide. There's a nice boardwalk trail that suited us, and it wound through an alpine meadow and ended up at a glacier field with a huge snowy icy glacier in full view. The park rangers are great, really helpful and friendly, constantly reminding the visitors how important these special places are, precious and irreplaceable, full of wildlife and flowers. A visit to a park like this restores your spirit. Probably the most thorough way to see the park is by backpacking into the vast wilderness on one of the 700 miles worth of trails. One hiker that we met said that he vacations here every year and hikes a different trail, carrying all his gear with him for sleeping and eating so he can stay out several days at a time. He also said the weather here changes very quickly and you have to be prepared for anything, including icy rainstorms, slippery terrain, or perhaps an encounter with a bear. Time seems short when standing in the midst of such tranquility. Lots of people traveled even farther than we did to get here, and I'm certain no one has been disappointed.
For more information about painting and travel with Roger and Sarah Bansemer, visit paintingandtravel.com.